Alright, we should be live. We're back, and we're working on Toph the first Metalbender. So, since this is my first one that's going to go up on YouTube as part of the actual whittling down of the card selection process, if you don't know how I do these, I stream all of the card selection process to begin with, but I don't post them on YouTube because it's a whole lot of me, like, scrolling through cards going, no, 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 maybe. Alright, we'll add it to the list. It's just a whole lot of that with occasional discussion on the cards that I'm selecting or why I'm not going to add certain cards to the list. But now that we're through all of that, we're going to start whittling down the cards. So what I like to do first is go over all of the cards that we've selected, and we'll start by talking about our commander real quick. So if you haven't seen Toph the first Metalbender, it's 1 red, green, white for a human warrior ally, 3/3. Non-token artifacts you control are lands in addition to their other types. At the beginning of your end step, Earthbend 2, which means you target a land you control. It becomes a base 0/0 creature with haste. It's still a land in addition to its other types, and it gets 2 1/1 counters because it's Earthbend 2 specifically. And if that land would die or become exiled after this effect is resolved, it returns to the battlefield tapped. So, Toph is very powerful. She does one of the things that I really like in oddball commanders, which is she turns one card type into another card type it isn't normally, and that allows for some very interesting shenanigans with certain cards, as we'll see when we get through it. Turning something into a land is one of the most interesting things. The fact that she can also then protect those cards by earthbending onto them, making it so that if they die or get exiled, they come back, which gets around a whole lot of interaction that opponents are going to likely run. Now, she can't save things if they kill it in response or whatever, but that's true of a lot of cards. The fact that she can even set up this situation, though, is pretty cool. So, she was one of the cards I was most interested in building a commander deck around. So, we have 175 cards on the list, and we'll be going 175 spells. We're trying to whittle her down to roughly 60 spells and 40 actual lands, and we'll see how she looks as we're crafting her. She might need fewer lands, but most likely she's going to need the 40 because she does need to have a certain amount of actual mana sources. And notably, when she turns the card into a land, it even says it in her reminder text, they don't innately have the ability to tap for mana. They can gain that from other sources, but she does not give them a land type, and therefore they don't tap for mana of any type, including colorless. So, as we scroll down to our Alpha Beta Unlimited, so as is tradition, we have selected Soul Ring and Swords to Plowshares. Also, if you're noticing the lands, do not worry if you do not have dual lands and your playgroup does not allow for proxies. I own them, so I always put them on the list. They are not essential. You can replace them with any other lands that tap for both colors of mana. But since I own them, I always include them on my lists. So, on the other hand, Mishra's Workshop. This is another one where if you don't have it, it's not essential. I own everything, so I like to play at the highest power level the deck can. And because I am running so many artifacts, a land that taps for 3 mana for only casting artifacts is basically an auto-include if you have it. Again, do not worry if you don't. It's not essential. It just makes the deck that much faster and more consistent. But if your playgroup doesn't have this power level and doesn't allow proxies to gain this power level, then you're fine. And if your playgroup has this power level and doesn't allow proxies, I think you need a different playgroup, because your playgroup is kind of being a bunch of jerks about it. Like, I don't need to beat you because I've spent more money on the game than you and have been playing since 1994. I don't need that. So if you have a cool deck and it's fun, I just want to play against it. It's a casual format. So I don't hold back when I build my decks, and I definitely jam all of the expensive cards I own into them, but that is not essential. A lot of the other cards, there are going to be some cards that are somewhat expensive that don't have replacements and work really well in the deck. And those I'm always a little bit sad about because then people that don't own them and can't proxy because of their playgroup don't really get to play the deck at its full potential. But if they don't have that power level and they don't let you proxy things, then you should be able to find at least suitable replacements from among the cards that I'm going to wind up cutting. Because you can still have like fun and interesting games with some of the other cool cards that I wound up cutting to make room for some of the more expensive things that I wanted to try out. So, Felwar Stone, we have a handful of mana rocks, but not actually that many. So the problem with mana rocks is you don't want to animate them with Toph because they are not actually that good. Turning your Arcane Signet into a 2/2 and then having it die and come back is a lot less impressive than turning a powerful artifact with a strong comes into play ability or a strong activated ability that requires you to sacrifice it or exile it to get that effect. Like, those are the type of cards you want to target with Toph, so it's actually better to ramp with lands for the most part, but I do have a handful of artifacts that tap for mana and come into play untapped at her 2-drop slot to help ramp into her and ramp into her other spells first. So Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet, and Soul Ring are all on the list, but I think the deck is much better off overall with like Rampant Growth, 3 Visits, Farseek, and Shared Roots, I think is the new Rampant Growth lesson. Next up, we get to one of the more interesting artifacts to recur, Jester's Mask. Oh, so notably, all of the things when they come back off of Toph do come back tapped from any earthbending. Returns to the battlefield tapped. So that will be a thing, but we have a few cards to interact with that also. So you might not be able to get the effect immediately again when you bring it back, if it requires a tap-activated ability, but you should still be able to recur it, and there will be times where you will actually get to untap it and then earthbend onto it again at end of turn and activate it again if you need to. So, Jester's Mask is a 5-drop artifact that it comes into play tapped innately, and it has 1 tap and sacrifice it. You look at your opponent's hand and deck, count the number of cards they had in their hand, and then choose a new hand from among those cards with the same number of cards in it, and then shuffle the remaining deck. So you get to either handcraft the opponent's hand to be as terrible as possible, or you can be political about it and give them certain spells with the idea that they will use them for something that is mutually beneficial to the two of you. Like, you can basically tutor their entire hand and sculpt it how you want it to be. So if they are friendly to you at the time, you can give them a hand that will allow them to undo what a third opponent is doing. And, they didn't have good cards, so now they have good cards, but they're using them on the other opponents, so you're still getting ahead on that deal. And you can also use it to take the opponent that has like a huge grip of cards and just replace them all with lands and have them have to rebuild their entire finely crafted hand just because they were vulnerable for like 1 turn where you popped off the Jester's Mask. Nature's Lure is another Farseek 3 Visits variant that I forgot to mention while naming all of the other ones. It gets a land with one of the basic land types, so it can get your dual lands and your Triome and whatnot. Zoran Orb lets you sacrifice a land to gain 2 life, and is itself a 0-drop artifact, which means that while it's in play, anything that Toph earthbends onto while she's out, you can then sacrifice, including your cool artifacts that you just put 2 counters on and guarantee that if they die, that they come back to the battlefield tapped and re-trigger their ETBs. So, enter the battlefield trigger. ETB, enter the battlefield. So that is one of your sack outlets. It's not the best one, but it's also a 0-drop. So you can do a whole lot of other stuff on your turn and still play the Zoran Orb and be able to sacrifice things and get them back for value. Enlightened Tutor. So I have Enlightened Tutor on the list. It is possible I want Worldly Tutor also, but I did leave it off the list for the time being because we have access to other creature-based tutors that are a little more effective for this deck. But Enlightened Tutor is one of the few ways we have to go grab an artifact specifically or enchantment and put it on top of the deck. Sacred Ground is an enchantment for 1 and a white, and when my land is put into the graveyard due to an opponent's card effect, I return that land to play. So notably, since all of our artifacts are lands, if our opponents destroy our lands in order to get rid of them before you can Metalbend onto them, they're going to come back. So as long as Toph is... They can't kill your artifacts while Toph is in play and this enchantment is in play at the same time. They have to kill Toph or the enchantment first. So that just puts another roadblock in their way to dealing with your problematic cards. Cataclysm. So this is one of the very few ones that can destroy all of my stuff too, normally. There'll be a few that can only destroy my stuff if Toph wanders off in the middle of resolving. But this is one of the few that can destroy all of your things also. But because it is going to make you... Well, it doesn't destroy. It makes you sacrifice all of the other permanents. If you can Metalbend onto enough stuff or Earthbend onto enough lands, when you cast Cataclysm, it will reduce everybody to 1 permanent of the original 4 permanent types. Notably, it will kill every single Planeswalker in battle in play because it does not allow players to choose either of those 2 card types to keep one of. So everybody gets to choose a land, an artifact, an enchantment, and a creature, and sacrifices the rest. So everything that you've managed to Earthbend onto will then die and come back, as well as one of each permanent type that you chose that you didn't Earthbend onto. So if you can keep Toph, you're doing amazing in that situation. And all of your other stuff is going to come back, ideally, and then everybody else will have only 1 permanent of each of those 4 types at most, and you will have like 5 to 7 other permanents in play if you can sculpt the situation properly. So that is the goal with Cataclysm. From Urza Saga, we have Smokestack, which is a 4-drop artifact at the beginning of your upkeep. So 2 triggers go on the stack at the beginning of your upkeep. One of them is to put a smoke counter or not onto Smokestack. The other one is to sacrifice a permanent for each smoke counter on Smokestack. And Smokestack will trigger for the second ability on each other player's upkeep also. So the idea is that you stack the triggers so that you sacrifice 0 permanents and then add a counter, and then on each other player's upkeep they will have to sacrifice a permanent, and then when it gets back to you, you can choose to sacrifice 1 permanent and add another counter to it or not. Well, you have to sacrifice a permanent, but you can stack the triggers again so that you only lose 1 permanent, regardless of whether or not you're going to add another counter to it. But with the effects of Toph, what you get to do is... it starts off on your upkeep, you sack 0 permanents and add a counter to it. You Metalbend onto it at end of turn. You go the entire turn cycle, and then before it comes back to your upkeep, you either sacrifice the Smokestack then, so that it will come back with 0 counters and tapped, and then on your turn you'll sack 0 permanents and then add another counter to it. Or what you can do is you can sacrifice a permanent and add another counter to it, and it'll keep doing its thing. Or you can sacrifice it to itself, and then it will come back tapped with no counters on it. You can Earthbend onto it again, and so every other turn cycle, every opponent will have to sacrifice a permanent. So you got a bunch of different options with Smokestack. You can also Earthbend onto a different permanent and keep sacrificing that one to Smokestack every turn. Preferably one that's generating value. And then each opponent is losing a permanent every cycle, and you're repeating the comes into play ability of the one that you're sacrificing constantly. Goblin Welder is a way to get back dead artifacts. It allows you to exchange an artifact you have in play for an artifact in your graveyard, which does mean that you are sacrificing the one from play. So you will be able to get it back if it's metal bent onto. So that works. Junk Diver is also a way to get back your dead artifacts. It's a 3-mana 1/1 bird, and when it dies, you return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. So if you metal bend onto Junk Diver, it will become a 2/2. Notably, all of your artifact creatures, because it makes them base 0/0, you're only going to get a 2/2. You're never going to just add power and toughness to them. They're always going to start off as 2/2s. So that is worth noting for some of the larger artifact creatures, is that you're going to be shrinking them in order to set this up. Metalworker taps to reveal any number of artifacts from your hand and add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool for each artifact revealed this way, which is most of the deck. Pattern of Rebirth is a 4-mana aura. Enchants a creature you control, and when enchanted creature dies, you search your library for a creature card, reveal it, and put it onto the battlefield. So, because all of your artifacts are going to get animated into creatures eventually by Toph anyway, and you want to sacrifice most of them for value anyway, now you can also tutor up one of your scarier artifacts that's not already, or one of your scarier creatures that's not already in play, and get that thing going. Storage Matrix, so this one is kind of funny. While it's untapped, it has that old school wording, so it has to be untapped for its effect to work. Each player has to choose artifact, creature, or land during their untap step, and then they only untap permanents of that type. Since all of your artifacts will also be lands, if you choose land, you can untap all of your artifacts and lands. If you get a Shaya into play, all of your creatures will also be lands, and so you can untap normally while opponents are stuck untapping one card type or the other. Which means the opponents that are ramping with mana rocks and trying to beat you down with creatures are especially hamstrung by this card. Aura Shards is one of those wonderful catch-alls to deal with opponents' problematic artifacts and enchantments. Notably, as long as your thing was an artifact creature that you had Earth bent onto, it will come back as a creature and therefore keep triggering Aura Shards. If it doesn't... Also, we have a few ways to blink creatures in this deck, because a lot of the Earthbenders are ETB triggers. So between the two of those, we can get a lot of value out of Aura Shards. And yeah, there will be times where it doesn't work because most of your creatures are not creatures when they enter the battlefield. But I still think it's worth it. This deck has a below average creature count for a creature heavy deck because of that. So it is worth noting that that might be an issue. Ladmary's Call is a 2-mana instant speed demonic tutor for creatures only. Aggravated Assault is one of the more interesting cards in the deck. So for 3 and 2 red, you untap all creatures you control and get an additional combat step. If your creatures combined tap for more than 5 mana, including 2 red mana, to activate this, you can tap all of your creatures for mana, activate the ability to untap it, and float the remaining mana and generate infinite mana. So we don't innately have anything to spend infinite mana on except for Staff of Domination, I believe. But we can still get a lot done with functionally infinite mana, and also of note, infinite combat steps. So as long as we have a creature that can attack through for any amount of damage, we have lethal at that point with Aggravated Assault in play. Get all of our fetch lands. Duplicant, when it enters the battlefield, it exiles target creature and then steals its stats. So we can keep exiling problematic creatures from the opponents. Lightning Greaves to protect Toph mostly, or anything else once we've animated it if we need to keep it in play. Mere Retriever is another Junk Diver variant. It's cheaper than Junk Diver, but also lacks flying, so it's kind of a trade-off. Oblivion Stone is the first of our proper mass removal spells. We have a whole lot on the list, and we're not going to be able to run all of them, but we are certainly going to run some of them, and they all have one thing in common, and that is they destroy non-land permanents. So with Oblivion Stone, you not only get to kill all of your opponent's non-land permanents and keep all of your artifacts because of Toph, but also if you can Earthbend onto it before activating it, you will get it back. And because it comes back, because it's sacrificed, it will come back before the effect to destroy all non-land permanents, but Toph will still be in play at that point, and it will still be a land, so it will not destroy itself that time, and now you still have a fully functional O-Stone in case you desperately need to pop it again to kill everything. So, or in case you can wait until you get back to having Toph in play, and then can destroy all of your opponent's non-land stuff while keeping all the stuff you saved the first time. Sculpting Steel, because most of our artifacts are powerful and have good comes into play abilities, or good death triggers, so having a way to copy them. Also of note, if you manage to Earthbend onto the Sculpting Steel itself, it can, and if it does not have its original thing that it copied, will have to change when it comes back, but it does get to keep changing, so you can keep reselecting what it comes back as from among the artifacts in play. Arcbound Ravager allows you to sacrifice artifacts to put counters on it, and then has modular 1. So when it dies, it enters with the 1/1 counter, and when it dies, it moves all of its 1/1 counters onto another artifact creature. So that can allow for a lot of counters moving around all of a sudden. And also as a free way to sacrifice your artifacts that you have Earthbent onto, so that way you can re-trigger their comes into play abilities or their death triggers or whatever, and then you can sacrifice them again to Arcbound Ravager once they come back, if that's helpful. Darksteel Citadel, because it's indestructible. Krark-Clan Ironworks is probably the best artifact sacrifice outlet ever, allowing you to turn your artifacts into colorless mana to cast more spells, especially when you're recurring those artifacts, means that you can generate huge amounts of mana very quickly. Staff of Domination lets you spend huge amounts of mana that you've generated on just about anything that you would want, including card draw. Kiki Jiki is in here because we do have a lot of creatures with cool comes into play and death triggers that Kiki can copy, including our animated artifacts, because now that they're animated, he can make a non-animated token copy of it that will then have come into play and eventually die, so we can get that benefit. Steve is in here to fetch lands. Sensei's Divining Top gets a little bit extra from this deck because we can now animate it if we need to. So that way it makes killing Sensei's Divining Top almost literally impossible. Also, I'm running all of the fetch lands, so I'm constantly shuffling my deck, so anything that lets me look at cards and make sure I'm getting the best draw every turn is worth considering. Doubling Season is in here, so we are not 1/1 counter focused, but by the very nature of our deck, there are going to be a lot of 1/1 counters thrown around. The deck is actually, weirdly enough, more focused on landfall than anything else, as we'll see when we get to the actual landfall cards. And it is trying to take advantage of the fact that your artifacts entering the battlefield are lands entering the battlefield for that. But because there are so many 1/1 counters getting thrown around, including by some of the landfall creatures, like Bristly Bill and Scythecat Cub, Doubling Season at least needed to be considered. even though we're not actually making a ton of tokens, just because there are going to be a lot of times where doubling up on the number of counters is just going to get completely out of hand. Farseek is in here for ramping. Got our dual lands. Flagstones of Trocaire. This is one that I used to run in every white deck I built, and it's kind of fallen off a little bit, but it's still pretty strong here. So when it dies, you get to tutor a card with the Plains type onto the battlefield tap to replace it. So if you can Earthbend onto this thing and then have it die, then you get to grab like your Jetmir's Garden or one of your other dual lands, and then it will come back and be ready to be sacrificed to go get another multi-land Plains. Mr. Stuffy Doll is probably not going to make it all the way through, but I love him so much, and he gets really scary if you can put a lot of counters onto him. As a 0-1, obviously he's not particularly impressive, but once he's, like a 5-5 or something, especially if you're attacking players other than the one he's currently linked to, because those players are actually incentivized to block Stuffy Doll to stop themselves from taking damage, if nothing else. So the other player will start taking the hits from it. This also allows you to effectively kill the player by running Stuffy Doll into an opponent with a huge board state, where they're like, okay, I agree, we need to get rid of that player, and they just block Stuffy Doll with everything, and all of that damage gets sent to that player. Vesuva can copy any of our animated, not even animated, any of our artifacts while Toph is in play. Sorry. In my brain, it's like, we need to actually use Toph. It's like, no, you don't. She makes them into land, so Vesuva can, in fact, copy them. Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. So, this one is a bit of an oddball. If you don't know the intricacies of the rules of Commander, you might be surprised to see this one, or genuinely shocked that it's legal in this deck. So, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth's exact game text is, lands you control are, not lands you control, lands are swamps in addition to their other types. So, it does not innately have the swamp characteristic, so it does not have the ability to tap for black mana in your deck or during deck construction. It has to be physically in play to grant that ability to the cards in play. And also of note, it does not give them the ability to tap for black mana. It gives them the swamp type, which has the innate ability to give them the ability to tap for black mana at that point. So, while Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is very obviously a black card, it does not have a black color identity for Commander. The reason why it's on the list is because your artifacts don't innately have mana abilities when they get turned into lands. Urborg gives them the ability to tap for mana at that point, and it's using up a land slot. Obviously, we are running Yavimaya also, but we only have room for so many cards that will grant these abilities, so using a land slot as another way to grant the artifacts the ability to tap for mana eases up the deck space a little bit, while essentially just being a colorless land otherwise in our deck, since we can't take advantage of it for fixing colors normally. Like, we're not going to be asked to pay black mana for any of our stuff, so unless an opponent has something that asks us to pay black mana or some other amount of mana, there are, I can think of 3 or 4 cards, but out of those 3 cards that are immediately coming to mind, 2 of them would never be relevant anyway, and those are the Skeletal Shard and Thrall Wizard. Because Thrall Wizard can only counter black spells, I believe. So that only leaves, I think it's Limdul's Hex as the only card where suddenly having access to black mana would be more useful than not. But it does allow all of our artifacts to tap for a mana, so even if it's only colorless for our purposes, it's still a huge game. Scapeshift is in here because, as I said, the deck is actually very landfall focused. So, being able to sacrifice a bunch of lands to play a bunch of lands, especially of note if we've managed to earthbend onto those lands, or if those lands are also artifacts with death triggers, we get a lot more value out of Scapeshift than we normally would, and we're already getting a decent amount of value out of it to begin with. Prismatic Omen is one of the few cards that allows our lands to tap for mana of any color. So we don't actually have a ton of room in the deck for that effect, but I do like to run like one or two of them if we can. So Prismatic Omen, and hang on, I'm blanking on the name of it. Chromatic Lantern are two most effective ways to get our lands to tap for mana. There's also Great Divide Guide and a couple of other cards on the list. So probably only two of them are going to make it, besides the Urborg and the Yavimaya. So I wanted to put all of them on the list, and then we'll figure out which ones we actually want to run. Aethersworn Canonist is 1 and a white for a 2/2 human cleric. Players can't cast more than one non-artifact spell per turn. This stops opponents from comboing off. It also stops players from casting a whole bunch of counter spells in a single turn, so they only get to counter like one thing. And since we are playing a lot of artifacts, chances are we will be able to cast another spell or two after that without having to worry about it. Lapse of Certainty. So Lapse of Certainty is on the list. Reprieve is not. And there's an argument to be made that either both of them should be on the list or neither of them should be. Lapse of Certainty is 2 and a white, counters target spell, but puts it on top of its owner's library instead of in the graveyard. It is Memory Lapse, except for 3 mana rather than 2. But it also stops problematic spells from resolving for a turn cycle normally. So that way, if the opponent has something that is going to ruin all of your finely crafted game plan, they kill Toph and then they go for the mass board wipe on your artifacts and whatnot. So that way, or non-land permanents, so that way they're actually destroying most of your stuff and you're only getting back like 1 or 2 of them. You can buy yourself time to get Toph back into play. Things like that. Path to Exile, one of the best removal spells ever printed. And now we start getting into the landfall cards, because now we are at where landfall officially debuted. And of course, there is only one of them from Zendikar. It is Lotus Cobra. All the rest are fetches and Valakut. But yes, Lotus Cobra to help make extra mana. Worldwake, we have Amulet of Vigor. So all of our lands are coming into play tapped off of Metal Bending when they come back. A lot of our lands come into play tapped anyway, and some of our artifacts innately come into play tapped. So this allows us to untap all of those cards when they come in, while Toph is in play, especially for the artifacts. So that way we can use them immediately. Ruin Ghost allows us to re-trigger ETBs on our lands by flickering our lands, and therefore our ETBs on our cool artifacts. Seer's Sundial is landfall you may pay 2 to draw a card. Terra Eternal is a 2 and a white enchantment and gives all lands indestructible. Of note, this does affect the opponent's lands, so while I was originally planning to run Terra Eternal regardless because I thought it was only ours, now maybe it doesn't make the deck because it also makes the opponent's lands indestructible for what that's worth, because we do have a bunch of things that will destroy various permanent types if they're not also things that we care about. So it's a little bit worse, but at the end of the day, a lot of our lands are also going to be creatures, so having all of them be indestructible and just be able to attack and block all of the time is probably worth more than the opponent's occasional man land being able to get up and safely attack or block successfully. Contagion Engine is a 6-drop artifact that comes into play to put a -1/-1 counter on each creature the opponent's control, and can 4 and tap to proliferate twice. So it is both a way to kill all of our opponent's creatures through a lot of different effects, including indestructible, while also being able to proliferate the +1/+1 counters that we're generating. So it works for both ends of the spectrum. Kuldotha Forgemaster lets us sacrifice 3 artifacts to tutor an artifact to play. So if we can Metalbend onto any of those artifacts ahead of time, we will get to keep them and also get to tutor our super expensive artifacts that will help us win the game faster, better, easier. Mox Opal is basically a land in this deck. Like, it does not need to take up a spell slot. I could probably put the land denotation in front of it because of that. Now, granted, there will be times where it's a land that doesn't produce mana, and that's a little bit awkward. But for the most part, it functions as a land in this deck just due to the sheer volume of artifacts. Green Sun Zenith is in here to tutor for our other Earthbenders, so that way we can get more counters flowing. Ichor Wellspring is one of the strongest cantripping artifacts for a deck like this. Because I draw a card when it enters and when it dies, it is very easy to generate a large amount of card advantage by recurring this card and sacrificing it for value. It is definitely the best one to do that with if you just need raw card advantage. Mirror works because we are playing so many artifacts with good comes into play and leaves play abilities. Being able to spend an extra 2 mana to get a token copy of them is normally worth it. Notably, the token copies will not be lands and will not benefit from some of the other effects we've got going on, but at the same time, a lot of our artifacts are strong enough that if we had the opportunity to just have a second copy for 2 extra mana, it would be 100% worth the investment. So, speaking of which, Spine of Ishsa kills any permanent when it enters, and when it dies, it returns to owner's hand. So, if we want to, we can choose to, if we've Metal Bent onto it, we can choose to return it to play, and then the return to hand won't be able to find it in the graveyard anymore, and then we can sacrifice it again to bring it back to our hand now, so that we can get extra benefits out of sacrificing it, and basically get the comes into play trigger 1 extra time for free. But also, if it just happens to die, we'll just get it back and recast it again. So, Beast Within, one of the better catch-all removal spells in all of Magic. Literally kills any permanent type, and the 3/3 Beast is negligible in Commander. Conjurer's Closet is one of the ways we have to flicker our earthbending creatures, also our creatures with comes into play abilities, and any lands we might have animated that we just want to get the effect and we haven't, or artifacts that we've animated, we just want to get the effect and we haven't found a sacrifice outlet. Obviously, the Closet and the earthbending will both try and bring them back, and only one of them can succeed. But it's still a thing that we can do if we needed to. Chromatic Lantern makes all of our things tap for mana. Thespian Stage can become a copy of any of our lands, which means it can copy any of our artifacts, and it will be a non-token copy, so we can earthbend onto it with Toph. Or we can earthbend onto it with somebody else before it becomes a copy of the thing. Courser of Crufix has landfall, we gain a life, and also lets us play lands off the top of our deck. Bearer of the Heavens. So when this dies, it destroys all permanents. Obviously, it will destroy all of our things too. It does not exclude lands. But this also means that we will be getting stuff back from having Earthbent onto it that the opponents won't. So it may be possible to create a board state where the opponents are desperately trying to find lands in order to cast removal spells on the one thing that we got to keep, or the 2 things we got to keep that are currently killing everybody. So that was an option, and we do have ways to sacrifice our things innately, so Bearer of the Heavens might just be able to die whenever we want it to. Ugin's Nexus. So this one is really brutal. I did have to double check the wording because I was not sure if it would work the way I wanted it to, and it does actually work the way I want it to, which makes it a lot of fun. So it's a 5-drop artifact. While it's in play, no player can take an extra turn. Then when it would die, I exile it instead and take an extra turn. So because it's not, it's one of those things like I thought the wording might be when this dies, you can exile it from your graveyard and then take an extra turn, which would not work with Toph because the earthbending would only try and bring it back from the graveyard, not from exile. But because you can exile it instead of putting in your graveyard to get the effect, then it will come back. So you can actually take infinite turns if they can't get rid of Toph or get rid of Ugin's Nexus before it gets earthbent onto again. Ugin the Spirit Dragon kills permanents with one or more colors in them, and also generates huge card advantage and can lightning bolt things. So he gets to get on the list, although I do think the other Ugin is much better for this deck. Omnath Locus of Rage has landfall, make a 5/5 elemental, and when one of your elementals dies, it deals 3 damage to any target. So we already are putting so many lands into play that Omnath can't help but make tons of 5/5s just by existing. Retreat to Emeria. So this one is also interesting. We are running Retreat to Emeria, but not Felidar Retreat, and that is because of how they work. Normally, Felidar Retreat would be the better one, because it's the exact same casting cost. Felidar Retreat makes 2/2 cats, or puts a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Retreat to Emeria makes 1/1 core allies, or gives all of my creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. It's the fact that it makes allies that actually allows it to be part of an infinite combo. So I believe the character's name is Haru from Last Airbender. He has an ability where when another ally enters the battlefield under your control, you make a 1/1 ally. Or not, I'm sorry, not 1/1 ally. You make, you can earthbend 1. So if you have an artifact creature, you can sacrifice the artifact creature with Toph out, have it die, and come back. It has to be earthbent onto. It'll die and come back, which causes it to enter the battlefield as an ally, or as a land rather, which triggers this to make an ally, which triggers Haru to earthbend onto it again. Now you can sacrifice it again. It's been earthbent onto, so it'll come back. It'll landfall trigger to make an ally. Ally will trigger Haru to put the counter on it. And so now you have an infinite loop, and you just need that artifact creature. You need like a meteor golem or something, and you will generate infinite value that way. So Retreat to Emeria makes it in, while Felidar Retreat does not. Alright, so I feel like I need to bring this up. I did not bring this up with the other land from World Wake, but we don't have a ton of the man lands in the deck, but the ones that we do have are particularly powerful, and Needle Spires is probably the strongest one that we're running. I didn't put Blinkmoth Nexus on because I do not, or it's not Blinkmoth, Inkmoth Nexus on because I do not really care for winning with Infect, and we don't have any other poison counters matters except for the Proliferate cards. So if we manage to damage somebody and they can finally deal with the land, basically all that damage was wasted, because they can't die to poison unless we get one of like 3 Proliferate cards going. But Needle Spires, because it animates into a double strike creature, is already absurdly powerful. Also worth noting, you can activate the abilities of the manlands to animate them. What that will do when they're already creatures is change their base power and toughness until end of turn to match whatever they turn into when you activate the ability. So because they're all 0/0s from earthbending, this will actually increase their power and toughness. So Needle Spires would get +2/+1 by activating its ability and gain double strike until end of turn. Tireless Tracker, landfall, make clues, so that way we have more card advantage. Cataclysmic Gearhulk. Similar to Cataclysm, which is where it gets its name from, each player chooses one of each non-land and non-battle permanent type. Again, it lists all of the permanent types, so they don't get to choose battles, but it does exist when Planeswalkers existed, so they do get to choose one of them. And then sacrifices all other non-land permanents. So they get to keep their lands, I get to keep all of my artifacts and lands, and some of my creatures that have been earthbent onto will come back. Panharmonicon doubles up on the ETB triggers for my creatures and artifacts entering, so this will double up on landfall triggers from artifact lands entering because of that. So all of the landfall triggers will trigger a second time because they triggered off of my artifact entering because my artifact was also a land. Gonti's Aetherheart, speaking of artifacts also being land and therefore getting double triggers. So when this or my other artifact enters, I get 2 energy, and I can pay 8 energy and exile this thing to take an extra turn. So it's a little more convoluted than Ugin's Nexus, but it's accomplishing the same thing, especially if you have anything that doubles up on the ETB triggers, because then you only need one other artifact to enter in order to have the 8 energy necessary to activate this thing, which becomes a lot easier. Heroic Intervention, because sometimes my stuff is actually in danger of dying and I need to keep it around, especially Toph. Scrap Trawler, when my artifact dies, I get a cheaper artifact back from the graveyard to my hand, I believe. Maybe it's to play. It's been a while. It doesn't really matter. It buys back dead artifacts. I probably should have written down exactly how it works. Hour of Revelation is another one of the destroys all non-land permanents, therefore saving all of my artifacts from destruction as well. Notably, it costs 3 white to cast if there are 10 or more non-land permanents in play, which none of my stuff will contribute to, so you need the opponents. I mean, my creatures will most of the time, and when they don't, that's even better for me. So if you want to cast it for 3 white, it's going to be on the opponents for the most part to have non-land permanents in play, since all of my artifacts won't count while Toph is out. And I probably don't want to cast it while Toph isn't out. Path of Metal, which flips into Metzali, the Tower of Triumph. So it's white and red for an enchantment. When it enters, it deals 1 damage to each creature that doesn't have either First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, or Haste. When I attack with 2+ creatures with this ability, I can flip it. On the other side, it's a land that taps for 1 mana of any color. I can also spend 1 in a red and tap it to deal 2 damage to each opponent, or 2 in a white and tap it to destroy a creature at random that attacked this turn. So, of note, when you earthbend onto a land, it becomes a creature with haste. Not until end of turn. A lot of things that grant haste only do until end of turn because the creatures still having haste on subsequent turns is a bit of a nightmare to keep track of. For some things, it's just added text that usually doesn't matter. The reason that Toph gives haste in the first place and all the other earthbending cards do is so that way you can't accidentally earthbend onto the land you just played. Especially on things like the Arena client and the MTGO client, where which land came into play is barely denoted. And if all of your lands have the same artwork, you can't really tell which one it is unless you are paying close enough attention. So to prevent the feel bad of accidentally earthbending onto one of your untapped lands to find out it was the one that came into play this turn, and therefore is now a creature that doesn't have haste, they gave it haste. and since it just gives it haste, that means that I will easily be able to attack with multiple creatures in a turn that have haste in order to flip this, so that way I can either use it as a way to damage each opponent each turn, or to destroy an attacking creature each turn, depending on what I want to do with it. Boltani Yavimaya Avatar. So it's a 6-drop 0/0 Reach Trample Elemental Avatar. Gets +1/+1 for each land I have, so all of my artifacts will be helping count for this. But also the 2 mana to bounce 2 of my lands to return this from my graveyard to my hand. Normally that would be bouncing 2 lands that you have to spend time and energy over the course of several turns or have extra land drops in order to get back into play. Now I can bounce my artifacts and recast them. And if they have cool comes into play abilities, that turns the cost of saving Multani and getting him back into play into an extra benefit of getting back Multani and getting him back into play. Urza's Ruinous Blast is a legendary sorcery that exiles all non-land permanents that aren't legendary. So notably, it will not kill Toph, but it also won't kill the opponent's commanders either. So that is a factor. Evolution Sage is a 3-mana 3/2 with Landfall Proliferate. Karn's Bastion is a land that can proliferate. Tomic both wrecks my deck real hard and stops opponents from wrecking my deck for the same reason. So 2 white for a Human Advisor. He's a 2/3 with flying. Lands in play and in graveyards can't be targeted by opponents. So I can still target my lands with Toph. They cannot target their lands or my lands with anything. So that also means that they can't target my artifacts while Toph is in play. Also, opponents can't play lands from graveyards. And they also can't target lands in graveyards, by the way, which also might be a factor. Heliod's Intervention is one of the better ways to destroy a large number of problematic artifacts and enchantments, because you can sculpt what is dying and what isn't, so I can make sure I keep my cool enchantments around while still getting rid of all the opponent's artifacts and enchantments, potentially. Obviously, I don't lose my artifacts either, but my artifacts are really hard to kill in this deck when it's functioning properly. The Ozolith. When one of my creatures that had counters on it leaves the battlefield, I can put those counters on the Ozolith, and then at the beginning of combat, I can move all counters from the Ozolith onto my creature. So, of note, the way this works is you don't just take the counters that were on the creature and put them on the Ozolith. You put an equal number of counters that were on that creature of those types onto the Ozolith instead, which means that the Ozolith will now have all of those counters on it to put onto something else. And that works the exact same way. You remove all the counters from the Ozolith, and then you put that many of those counters onto the thing. And the reason why this distinction is important is because of cards like Doubling Season, which now will double the number of counters that you're putting on your permanent. So a few of them specifically say creatures, so you won't double the number of counters going on the Ozolith, but you will double the number of counters coming off of the Ozolith onto another creature. So if I doubled the number of counters on my guy, if I was supposed to put 1 counter, I put 2 onto it, and then it dies, the Ozolith will get those 2 counters, and then when I move the counters off of the Ozolith, if the other source was still in play, I'll be putting 4 counters on the new thing, which will then die and put 4 counters on the Ozolith, and then put 8 counters, and you can see how this could go out of hand very quickly, especially if I'm getting to decide when those things are leaving the battlefield. Ancient Green Warden doubles up on my landfall triggers and allows me to play lands from my graveyard. Ashaya turns all of my non-token creatures into lands. It's very important, by the way, that both of these things say non-token, because you immediately go infinite with anything that landfalls to make the appropriate permanent type. And there are a lot of things that landfall to make appropriate permanent types. So Ashaya is also non-token creatures, but now that means that Toph herself is a land. Good times. Scoot Swarm Landfall, make a 1/1 insect. If you have enough lands in play, which we will definitely have enough lands in play, instead you make a copy of Scoot Swarm. And yeah, that gets very out of hand. Maskwood Nexus means that all of our creatures will be allies, among other things. So when our creatures come into play, they will trigger Haru. So Oswald Fiddlebender allows us to sacrifice an artifact to tutor an artifact with mana cost equal to one more than the sacrificed artifact's mana value and put it directly into play. He is a birthing pod for artifacts, and that is the main focus of our deck. Teleportation Circle is the enchantment version of Conjurer's Closet. Brilliant Restoration allows me to reanimate all my dead artifacts and enchantments for 7 mana. Kodama of the West Tree is whenever one of my modified... First of all, my modified creatures have trample. Whenever a modified creature deals combat damage to a player, I can ramp a basic land directly from my deck into play tapped, so just rampant growth. Which will allow us to get all of the basic lands out of our deck very quickly if somebody is vulnerable, because this is not one or more, this is for each one that hits. And since all of my things with 1/1 counters are modified, and we are putting 1/1 counters on basically everything. Bootlegger's Stash. Oh, I'm sorry, we skipped over Lion Sash. Lion Sash is my graveyard hate card. We don't currently have Scavenging Ooze on the list, so it is my primary graveyard hate card. It is an artifact creature that can allow me to exile cards from graveyards, and if I happen to exile a permanent, it gets 1/1 counters, and then it boosts the creature that it becomes equipped to if you turn it into an equipment. Bootlegger's Stash gives all of my lands the ability to tap to make a treasure, which, when you have things that care about artifacts entering, means that all of my artifacts now have the ability to tap to make an artifact. They will be token artifacts, so we won't get all of the cool things, but we will get some things, and we're just making extra mana, so it's all good. Malera, Scholar of Antiquity, is red and green 1 for a 3/3 elf. I can tap my non-token artifacts to add green, so this is another way to have all of my artifacts tap for mana. And I can tap 2 non-token artifacts to exile my top card, and I can play it this turn. So it gives me access to more cards. Haywire Might is an excellent way to deal with opponents' problematic non-creature artifacts and enchantments, and gains me life in the process. And if we've managed to earthbend onto it, we get to keep doing that until we've gotten rid of all of the problem stuff. Loran is on the list because we'll be running the one Nisa, so we don't want unnecessary elves or elementals in the deck if we can help it. So Loran being an elf that we can't bump into, or being a creature that's not an elf we can bump into, while still having the same effect as Reclamation Sage. And she also has the ability to let us and another opponent draw a card, if that becomes a factor. The Mightstone and Weakstone has 2 powerful abilities when it comes into play. We can either draw 2 cards or give a creature -5/-5. So if we can keep animating it, we can keep choosing which one we need at any given point in time. Also, it taps for mana that can be used to cast our artifact spells or activate any of our abilities. Urza Silex is our next destroy all non-land permanents, so it's not quite all non-land permanents. So what it does is you spend the mana, tap and exile it, then each player chooses 6 lands they control and destroys all permanents not chosen this way. When this thing is exiled from play, I can pay 2 to tutor for a planeswalker to my hand. So this allows you to keep a bunch of stuff that the opponents don't get to. The opponents are restricted to lands because they're not going to have anything that's letting their other permanents be lands unless they have Toph or Ashaya. But then we get to choose from among our artifacts and lands, and it also destroys the rest. So we have several indestructible lands in the deck, We also have a handful of ways to make our other stuff indestructible, and anything that was earthbent onto will come back. So this allows us to keep a bunch of problematic permanents and most of our lands while the opponents are just losing all but a handful of their lands. And it lets us tutor for Ugin. All will be one when I put counters on my permanents, or when I get counters like the energy counters. I can deal that much damage to any target. Elish Norn doubles up on our triggers while denying our opponent their triggers. Nahiri's Resolve is another Conjurer's Closet, except I can exile any number of my non-token artifacts and creatures, and then they will come back into play on my next upkeep. So we can dodge a lot of sorcery speed removal, and also hide a bunch of stuff until we are ready to earthbend onto it. Nisa Resurgent Animist is our Lotus Cobra that can also give us a random elf or elemental every time we landfall twice in the same turn. Gandalf doubles up on our triggers for our legendaries and artifacts entering the battlefield, and gives those spells flash as well, and has flash himself, so you can ambush people with him, and then you can cast your artifacts and legendary spells at instant speed, and then you can double up on their triggers. So the One Ring, it's a powerful indestructible artifact that draws you a ton of cards, and its only downside is that if it stays in play too long, you will probably die, so the fact that we can sacrifice it and have it come back and still be an indestructible artifact, even if we don't get the protection trigger from it coming back, is just kind of an added bonus. Stroke of Midnight is slightly worse than Generous Gift in that it can't target lands, but it also only gives the opponent a 1/1, and most of the time that's going to be fine. Splunking allows our lands to enter untapped, and it draws me a card and puts an extra land into play, so we got that going on. Thousand Moon Smithy and Barracks. So the front side is an artifact that ETBs to make a 0/0 that gets +1/+1 for each artifact and creature I have, and I can tap 5 of my artifacts and creatures to transform it into a land that has an activated ability to add white mana, and if you spend that mana on an artifact or creature spell, you get another one of those gnomes. So notably, it is an artifact on the front face and a land on the back face, so it's pretty easy to earthbend onto it on either. And it does not exile itself, it just flips over, so it will still be an earthbent permanent, even if you did it to the front face. And then when it dies, it will come back and make another one of those tokens and be ready to flip back over to start making more of those tokens again. So, good times to be had by all. We have all of the Surveil lands, because they're just really strong. There's Bristly Bill, who is here to put counters on your stuff for landfall. And then he has an activated ability that doubles the number of 1/1 counters on your creatures. So, yeah, that's fun. Brightglass Gearhulk is a 4/4 first strike trample for double green, double white. When it enters, I tutor for 2 1-drop artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. And we have several 1-drop artifacts and a handful of 1-drop creatures as well that we can tutor for with this thing. So as long as we keep enough of those, and I have to double check the exact number, we should be able to run the Brightglass Gearhulk. Sorry. There's a Dust Hulk in Alara that I think is made of glass also. So yeah, Brightglass Gearhulk. Salvation Engine, one of the very few vehicles. So how vehicles work when you animate them with Toph is they can't be crewed anymore because they don't have... Their power and toughness has been adjusted and they are now creatures. So the crew cost doesn't do anything. I think you can still technically crew them, but it doesn't do anything. Unless it cares about being crewed. But it won't change the power and toughness anymore. It's already an artifact creature. But what we do is, because we have animated it, we can now just attack with it. It doesn't need to be crewed. So while this thing does lose out on its stats of 610, it also loses out on not having to crew 6 anymore. So the two things kind of cancel each other out, and it still has its attack trigger. So when it attacks, I just return my dead artifact from my graveyard to play. And since it's been metal bent onto, the fact that it's a 2/2 doesn't matter as much, because now it's going to get blocked and killed and just come back. And we can still animate it the old-fashioned way by crewing 6, and it does still give all of my other artifact creatures +2/+2. Ugin, Eye of Storms, has the cast trigger of casting a colorless spell to exile an opponent's permanent that has one or more colors. He does other things too, but the fact that he gets that cast trigger and all of your other colorless spells have that cast trigger in a deck full of colorless artifacts is just so brutal. Chocobo Racetrack is an artifact with a landfall ability that makes chocobos, which are 2/2 birds, with a landfall ability to get +1/+0 until end of turn. So when Toph is out, this thing makes a chocobo for itself entering the battlefield. And then it boosts all of your birds if it enters the battlefield again somehow. And all of your other artifacts entering make more birds and boost all the birds that were already in play. You can see how that might be a thing. Gladiolus, both tutors a land to play and has a landfall ability to give +2/+2 and trample. Traveling Chocobo doubles up on landfall triggers and allows you to play lands off the top of your deck, and birds too if you find them. Also, if your birds are somehow triggering things, like if Traveling Chocobo enters while Ashaya is in play, that will also double up on the triggers, because birds also double up on triggers. I do have Adasia, similar to Mirrorworks. My artifacts are incredibly powerful, so making a second copy of them is pretty strong. Tanic, landfall deals a damage to each opponent, and if you trigger it twice in the same turn, you draw a card. Terra Symbiosis is once per turn when I put +1/+1 counters on my creatures, I can draw cards equal to the number of +1/+1 counters I put on a single creature. So if I just put a counter on something, or a counter, like one counter on each of my creatures, I get to draw a card. If I manage to put like 3 or 4 counters on a creature, like say by activating Bristly Bill to double up the number of counters on something, then I get to draw that many instead. Warmaker Gunship is the only spaceship I have on the list. Its ETB is to deal damage to an opponent's creature equal to the number of artifacts I have in play. So you do not need to station this thing. You can just Earthbend onto it, and then it'll be a 2/2. You do have to station if you want it to become a large flyer, but that's entirely up to you. After that, though, once it's been Earthbend onto, it can die and come back and dome something else. And given the sheer volume of artifacts, that means we can probably kill anything that's not indestructible. Or hexproof. Weapons manufacturing. So I have a ton of ways to sacrifice artifacts, and I'm constantly having non-token artifacts enter. So we should be able to stockpile a huge amount of munitions that we can then throw at our opponents or their creatures or both. Alright, now we get into the Avatar cards, which are mostly Earthbending cards. I do have Airbender's Ascension here, because it is another way to blink my Earthbenders. Bossing Say is a repeatable way to Earthbend, just for a mana investment. Badger Mole Cub, of course, not only does it Earthbend, but it also makes it so that my creatures that tap for mana tap for an additional green, which means that all of my animated lands and animated artifacts are now tapping for extra mana. The Boulder is probably the weakest one, since he has to attack to Earthbend. Boomy Unleashed ETB is to Earthbend, and if he ever gets to for combat damage, he untaps all of my lands, which can be a huge thing in and of itself, and then gives me an extra combat step where only my lands can attack. Earth Kingdom General ETB is to Earthbend too, but also when I put counters on my creature once per turn, I can gain that much life, so similar to the card draw effect from the other thing. I can either gain a tiny amount of life once, or if I happen to put enough counters on something from one effect, I can gain a ton of life. And he's earthbending too, so. Earthbender Ascension is an Earthbend 2 ETB and ramps a land into play, and my landfall gives it counters. When it has 4 or more counters on it, it also puts a 1/1 counter on my creature and gives it trample. There's Haru Hidden Talent, so ally ETBs, I get to Earthbend 1. Legend of Kyoshi, her front face is, Chapter 1 is draw cards equal to my highest power, so it can be a huge card draw spell right off the bat. Chapter 2, I Earthbend X based on cards in hand. Chapter 3, she exiles and comes back transformed, and gives my land creatures hexproof, and gives all of my lands hexproof and trample, and taps to add X mana of any one color where X is my highest power. So she can generate huge amounts of mana, card advantage, is an Earthbend trigger. She basically has everything going on for her. Planetarium of Wan Shi Tong. I do have my Scry lands, or my Surveil lands rather, from Mirza Karlov Manor, and a few other ways to Scry and Surveil, and it's just an incredibly strong value engine, and I wanted to put it in the deck. It might not make the cut just because this isn't the best deck for it, but we can certainly do things that will make it a lot stronger. Shared Roots is one of the land rampers. Toph, Hard-Headed Teacher. Every time I cast a spell, I get to Earthbend 1. And if it happens to be a lesson, it gets an additional 1/1 counter, which we have exactly 1 lesson in Shared Roots. But yeah, every time I cast a spell, I get to Earthbend 1, and she buys back an instant or sorcery from my graveyard if I want her to. Toph the First Metalbender is our commander. Then we have from the Avatar Jumpstart set, Boomy Eclectic Earthbender. He ETBs to Earthbend 1, which is a little bit disappointing, but when he attacks, I put a +1/+1 counter on each of my land creatures. So he can actually get pretty out of hand, and he is still ETB to Earthbend, so he's worth considering. Earthbending Student is the one that got left off of the main list and can only be purchased as a foil or opened as a foil from the collector boosters. It ETBs to Earthbend 2, and it is a 3-drop, so it's one of the most efficient Earthbending cards as far as just ETB Earthbend. Which I think we skipped over Toph Blind Bandit, who should also be on this list when I did my commander. Right? Did I not put the Blind Bandit Toph on here? Because she should definitely be on here. Uh-oh. Oh, that's my bad. Hang on, we need to fix that then. Alright, so Toph, Blind Bandit. Oops. 2 and a green. Human, ally, warrior, because that's what all of her creature types are on all of her cards. 0/3. Oh, excuse me. ETB. Earthbend 2. This gets +X +O based on power of my lands, I believe. I have to double check that. It might be equal to the number of 1/1 counters on lands you control. So we're actually at 176. Alright. So anyway, getting back to the other card. So Toph, Earthbending Master, is the experience counter Toph. So notably, when you attack, you Earthbend X, where X is the number of experience counters you have, and she landfalls to get experience counters. So what you can actually do if you don't have a land to play with her is to play her, attack with something, Earthbend 0 onto one of your lands or, artifacts that counts as a land. It will immediately die because it's a 0/0, but it did get Earthbent onto, so it will also immediately come back and trigger her landfall. So you can actually do that if you have an attack with any of your things. Earthshape is from the one of the box sets, one of the like panorama scene box sets. So it is 2 and a white for an instant. When you cast it, it earthbends 3. Then creatures with power less than or equal to that specific land that you earthbent 3 onto gain hexproof and indestructible, and you also gain hexproof until end of turn. So it's going to be for at least 3. But if you earthbend onto something that already has counters on it, then it will be larger and protect more of your stuff. Toph, Greatest Earthbender is from, I think, the other box scene set. So each of these cards are from the 2 different box sets. She ETBs to Earthbend X, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast her, and land creatures I control have double strike. So, similar to the other Toph, if you blink her, you will have spent 0 mana to cast her on her ETB, which means the thing will die instantly and come back because you Earthbent onto it. So if you want to trigger an ETB again or a Leaves Play trigger, you can blink her and she will just immediately trigger it again because she'll make it a 0/0. Imperial Recruiter, a large number of the creatures in this deck have relatively low power, so it can tutor for a lot of different things. 3 Visits is another land ramping spell. Strionic Resonator lets me copy my triggered abilities, which the Earthbending all is. Like, there's only one activated Earthbending ability in Bossing Say. Perilous Vault is Oblivion Stone, except it exiles and costs an additional mana and can't protect anything from its own effect. But that's okay, it's exiling all non-land permanents, so Toph is here to help. Very similarly, you will exile it from its own effect, but if it got Earthbent onto it, will just come back, and then it will still be a land, so it will not exile itself the second time to its own effect, while it's killing Toph and all of your opponent's stuff. Meteor Golem is one of the strongest things you can constantly recur, as it destroys a non-land permanent each time. Elvish Reclaimer lets you sacrifice a land to tutor for a land and put it into play, and when you have enough dead lands, it gets +2/+2, I believe, or +3/+3, something like that. Doesn't really matter. You can sacrifice lands to tutor for lands, which means you can sacrifice your now land artifact creature that's been Earthbent onto in order to get a land into play. Leyline of Abundance allows your creatures that tap for mana to tap for an additional mana, similar to the Mole. Mossborn Hydra is a 3-mana 0/0 with a 1/1 counter on it. Landfall, double the number of 1/1 counters on it. It has Trample. It will, in fact, kill your opponent dead. In fact, I think I left off the Trample, but it definitely has that. That is one of its defining things, is that it innately has Trample. But yeah, so it's a 1/1 with Trample, and landfall double its power and toughness in the form of 1/1 counters. Play of the game is a sorcery for 8 mana that just exiles all non-land permanents. It has assist, but most players are probably not going to help you win the game. It is very effective at doing that, though. Force of Vigor allows you to destroy 2 artifacts or enchantments, and can be cast for free by exiling a green card on another player's turn. Scrapyard Recombiner is a 0/0 with modular 2. You can tap and sacrifice an artifact to tutor a construct to your hand. A lot of our artifact creatures are constructs, so you can actually go get them with this thing, while sacrificing stuff that will just come back anyway. Esper Sentinel is a 1-mana 1/1 artifact creature, and it has an ability to draw a card if the opponent casts a non-creature spell and doesn't pay X, where X is its power. So you can Earthbend onto it to make it a 2/2. And then after that, you can do other stuff to increase its power and toughness. And make it so that the opponent basically has to give you a card every time, the first time each turn that they cast a non-creature spell. Liquid Metal Torque Has the ability to turn a non-land permanent into an artifact until end of turn, which allows us to earthbend onto Toph herself or our other creatures with cool comes into play abilities if we can't find a Shaya. We have all of the indestructible artifact land bridges. Tireless Provisioner has landfall, make a treasure or food. There's Yavimaya. Springheart Nantuko. If it's on a creature, when you landfall, you can pay 1 in a green to make a copy of that creature. And if it's not on a creature or you don't want to spend the mana, you can make a 1/1 insect instead. Hamza, Guardian of Arabin, which is a location in Tarkir. Costs 1 less to cast for each +1/+1 counter you have on it. And my other creature spells cost 1 less to cast for each creature I have with a 1/1 counter on it. And my other creature spells cost that much less while this is in play. So it is a 6-drop that costs 1 less for each one of the things you've earthbent onto, and then makes all of your other creature spells that much cheaper. So it is a huge cost reduction effect in this deck. Notably, it doesn't care how many counters are on any given creature, just how many creatures have counters on them that you control. Arcane Signet to ramp, Darksteel Mutation to shut off powerful commanders. Tempt with Discovery, because my lands are pretty powerful, and getting to ramp a bunch of lands into play, for each opponent only getting to ramp 1 land into play. Especially things like Vesuva, where I get to potentially make more of my artifacts instead. So having a couple of ways to tutor any artifact or any land I want into play gets a little bit stronger. Scrap Mastery is living death for artifacts, so if I have more good artifacts in the graveyard than I have in play, then we just want to cast Scrap Mastery. Also, anything that's in play that's earthbent onto is coming back anyway, so we get that on top. Titania, Protector of Argoth, regrows a land from my graveyard to the battlefield when she enters, and whenever one of my lands dies, I get a 5/3 elemental. That includes my artifacts that count as lands, even though she doesn't really care for artifacts that much, being primarily a main character from the Brothers' War, and the person on whose land the final conflict took place, and who would prefer not to have her landscape blasted to hell and back. She takes that one personally, hence the sheer number of giant angry elementals, which are also giant angry elementals for Omnath, by the way. Just in case. Blade of Cells, because everything I have in this deck wants to have more copies of itself anyway, so getting to attack with something, especially something that has been earthbent onto and will come back if it dies, so we get a bunch of non-earthbent copies of it, get the ETB triggers. If they happen to be creatures, they'll be tapped and attacking also for each opponent that we have. Teferi's Protection, because sometimes just being a land isn't enough to save all of our stuff, or sometimes we really need to save like Toph and some other things. Aeon Engine is kind of weird, so this one only really works if there's 4 more players, but you basically get to remove one of those players from the game while this is functioning. So what it does is it reverses the turn order each time you activate it. So it's tap and exile it to reverse the turn order, and it does ETB tapped. So what you do is you earthbend onto it, you let it go to the player to your left's turn, and then before their end step you activate it, and now the turn order reverses, and now it goes back to you. So you can do this with 3 players, where you get an extra turn for every turn that either other player takes, because you keep reversing direction and having it pass through you. But anybody not on either side of you no longer gets a turn while this is functioning, until you have killed one of the 2 opponents, and now you have to let that other player go. Dismantling Wave. For each opponent, you get to choose one of their artifacts or enchantments and destroy it. You can also cycle it to destroy everything. I like cards that let me blow up a permanent, like one of each permanent from each player. And so this way you get to blow up one artifact or enchantment that each player controls. Flawless Maneuver and Deflecting Swap, because we need to protect Toph and possibly our other stuff if the opponents are trying to Armageddon or something. And let's be honest, with the power level of this deck, we can't really argue if somebody tries to play a full-on Armageddon effect against us. Manascape Refractor gives us all of the has all of the activated abilities of all lands I control, which means it also has all the activated abilities of all artifacts I control while Toph is in play, which gives it a whole lot of abilities. Trove Warden is a 3/4 Vigilance with landfall, exile a permanent from my graveyard with mana value 3 or less, and when this dies, put each card that it had exiled into play under its owner's control. So I can exile a whole bunch of my stuff with landfall that's died, and then when this goes away, I get all of that stuff back. Alibu Ancient Witness is 3 white and red for an artifact creature golem 4/5. My other artifacts have haste, and when my artifact creature attacks, this deals X damage to any target, and I scry X based on the number of tapped artifacts I control. So, because I can give my artifacts the ability to tap for mana, I can tap even artifacts that don't normally have a tap activated ability, and Alibu can deal a ton of damage and let me scry a whole bunch. Angel of the Ruins can either be plane cycled or is a giant angry artifact creature that exiles opponents' artifacts and enchantments when it enters. Eudora the Grave Gardener is another really interesting one. So, when my other non-token creature dies, I can return it to the battlefield face down, and it is considered to be a forest land and nothing else. Which means I can then Earthbend onto it, which will make it a 2/2, and then when it dies, whenever something dies and comes back in that way, it always comes back as its front face, which means now it will be a face-up, whatever it was before, and if we animate it again and it dies, it will come back as a face-down, yeah. So we can do a lot of fun stuff with that also. Wake the Past reanimates all of my dead artifacts and gives them haste. It's also 7 mana, but it's a bit easier on the mana requirements than Brilliant Restoration is. But we do have a decent number of enchantments, so we'll have to see which one we actually want. Kami of Celebration is a 5 mana 3/3. When my modified creature attacks, I get to exile the top card of my library and can play it this turn. When I cast a spell from exile, I can put a 1/1 counter on my creature. So, notably, the creature only has to attack, it doesn't have to deal damage. So, even if my, Earthbent creature dies and gets to come back, I still get the card that I exiled. Resourceful Defense. When one of my permanents with counters on it leaves play, I can put those counters onto one of my other permanents. And for 4 and a white, I can move all counters from one of my permanents to another. So, very similar to the Ozolith. Tiller Engine. When my land enters tapped, I choose one. I can untap that land, or I can tap an opponent's non-land permanent. Both super helpful. Excise the Imperfect. Exiles a non-land permanent and lets its controller incubate X, where X was its casting cost. It's just a decent catch-all removal spell, similar to some of the other ones I'm running. And it does exile the problematic permanent. Uncivil Unrest gives my non-token creatures Riot, so they can ETB with a +1/+1 counter on it, or with haste. And whenever my creature with a 1/1 counter on it deals damage to a permanent or player, double the damage. So, that obviously gets very out of hand when all of my stuff has counters on it. Tributary Instructor is a Merfolk Shaman for 3 and a green with Mentor, and when my creature with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, I draw a card. Unexpected Absence. For each opponent, I exile a non-land permanent they control, and then that player cloaks the top card of their library. Edgar, Master Machinist. Once per turn on my turn, I can cast an artifact from my graveyard, and it enters tapped. When this attacks, it gets +X/+O, where X is the highest CMC among my artifacts. Surge Conductor is a 3-mana artifact robot for a 3/2. When my non-token artifact ETBs, I proliferate. We've got the new red-white cycling land and red-white Battle for Zendikar style land from this particular commander deck set. Canoptic Tomb Sentinel from Warhammer 40k is a 4-mana 4/3 with Vigilance. When it enters, if it entered from a graveyard, I exile a non-land and I can unearth it for 7, which means that if I earthbend onto it and make it a 2/2, when it dies, it will come back, it will have entered from the graveyard, and it will exile a non-land permanent. Crisis of Conscience is 4 white. I choose one, destroy all tokens, or destroy all non-token, non-land permanents. So I can either kill all of the tokens from the token deck, or I can destroy everything except for my lands and artifacts. And other people's tokens. The Pride One Steel Flagship is 6 for a 6/6 vehicle. Whenever my artifact enters the battlefield, including this one, I make a 2/2 knight that gets... This creature has +2/+2 as long as an artifact entered this turn, and has crew 2. So my artifacts entering give me 2/2 knight tokens, and those 2/2 knight tokens are 4/4s as long as an artifact entered, and considering I can sacrifice an artifact to have that artifact come back, I can basically guarantee these things are going to be 4/4s whenever I need them to be. Branching Evolution is the half of Doubling Season equivalent for 1/1 counters that Parallel Lives is for the tokens, so it doubles up on the number of 1/1 counters I'm getting. Preston the Vanisher. Whenever my other non-token creature enters, if it wasn't cast, I make a copy of it, except it's a 0/1 illusion, and I can pay 1 and a white and sacrifice 5 illusions to exile a non-land permanent. So, if my artifact creature is earthbent onto and dies, it will come back. It wasn't cast, so I will also make a 0/1 copy of it. If I do this enough, I can also sacrifice those tokens to exile another non-land permanent. So good times are had by all. Well, had by me anyway. Opponents probably aren't having a good time right now. Scythe Cat Cub is another Bristly Bill variant. Puts a lot of 1/1 counters on things. Captain Rex Nebula from Unfinity has the ability at the beginning of combat, I can have my non-land permanent become an artifact vehicle until end of turn. It has power and toughness equal to its mana value, and crew 2, and when it deals combat damage, I roll a d6, and if the result equals the mana value of that permanent, I sacrifice it and deal that much damage to any target. Most notably, though, Rex Nebula can turn my creatures into artifacts, which will then be lands because of Toph, which means I can now earthbend onto them. And once they have been earthbent onto, it doesn't matter if they stop being artifacts, creatures, or lands at end of turn. They have been earthbent onto, they are now 2/2s, and when they die, they will come back. And that is all I'm concerned with there. So it's another way to protect my creatures by turning them into artifacts temporarily. Blaster Combat DJ. So my other non-token artifact creatures have Modular 1, which not only means that they enter with an additional 1/1 counter, but also when they die, I get to move their counters around. When this gets a 1/1 counter, I can transform it. I can also cast it for its other side for 1 red and a green. The flip side is a legendary artifact with Modular 3, and it has X-Tap, move that many 1/1 counters from it onto my other artifact, and then if it has no counters on it, it transforms back. And our last card is Black Panther Wakandan King. Is white and a green for a 2/2 first strike, and when my creature enters the battlefield, I put a +1/+1 counter on my land. And I can spend 3 mana to move all 1/1 counters from one of my lands onto one of my creatures, gain life equal to the number of counters moved this way, and draw 1 card. Okay, so that is all of the cards that have the potential to be in Toph. We have to cut 116 of them, but it seems reasonably doable. Usually I have like 200 plus cards, so this is pretty good. I did get the chance to play with Toph on Brawl, on Arena for the Brawl Builder Challenge, so that informed a lot of the cards that I chose to keep on the list and a lot of the things that didn't make it onto there because I'd actually gotten the chance to play with some of them. There are cards on the list that I could have run in Brawl Toph that I'm not running, or that are on this list that I didn't run in Brawl Toph because Brawl is a different format and because we don't have access to certain cards that they would interact with. Like Haru, for example, is not on the Arena version because Retreat to Emeria isn't. So it was pretty easy to cut him from that one because he didn't trigger as often. Um, so yeah, that's going to do it for me for right now. Next time we'll start whittling down the list. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you then. Have a good rest of your day.